We're not crazy, the system is. Tune in to Madness Radio, voices and visions from outside mental health. Wednesdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern Time on Pacifica affiliate WXOJLP-FM 103.3 Valley Free Radio. Produced by Freedom Center and the Icarus Project, streaming live, podcasting, and archived at madnessradio.net. Welcome to Madness Radio. This is your host, Will Hall. And today I'm really psyched because our guest is punk rock legend Bonfire Madigan Shive. She's going to be telling us a lot about her life and her relationship to the mental health system and extreme states of consciousness and her creative process. So that's coming up in a second. First, a few words about the producers of Madness Radio. Freedom Center is a local activist, advocacy, and support community in Western Massachusetts for people who've been labeled in the psychiatric system and who are looking for alternative approaches to the mainstream system. We have a bunch of holistic services, including an acupuncture clinic, yoga classes, writing groups. We do educational events. We have a protest coming up for better care in the local system here. That protest is going to be on July 29th. We also have a website, freedom-center.org, that you can check out all the different things that we're doing. A lot of resources up there for people who are looking for human rights, who are looking for alternatives to mainstream psychiatric approaches. And Madness Radio is also co-produced by the Icarus Project, which is primarily an online community, but there are local groups in a number of different cities, and there's a growing interest internationally as well in the Icarus Project. Icarus is a support community of people who are looking beyond the medical model for understanding what we go through, including creativity and spirituality, seeing our experiences that would get labeled mental disorders as instead dangerous gifts that need care and cultivation. You can find out more information at theicarusproject.net.
No, what do we do? Okay.
Well, it's my great pleasure to welcome onto the show Bonfire Madigan Shive, who is an independent musician, radical mental health activist, staff person with the Icarus Project, who has quite a history in rock and roll and punk as one of the creators, founders, initiators, instigators of Riot Grrl at a very young teenage, and just one of my favorite people in the world. So welcome to the show, Madigan Shive.
Thank you so much. It feels so great to be here. And I'm such a fan of this program and of its illuminations and of its expansion in the world. So hello, Madness Radio. I feel right at home.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I wanted to have you on for a while, so it's great to have. And we're here in this soundproof studio at your house in Brooklyn. You're going to be in an anthology, a writing anthology. Tell us about, because that's kind of some exciting news from Bonfire Madigan Land.
Right. This just happened, actually, the last few days. I'm just coming back to the East Coast and to Brooklyn from being on tour and working in San Francisco and being on tour on the West Coast. 7 Stories Press, which is an independent publishing house here in New York that I'm really a fan of what they've put out. So they're putting together an anthology called Live Through This. And the kind of working second title is Women Artists on Self-Destruction and the Creative Healing Process. And it's really exciting because the anthology already has confirmed a bunch of really my heroes and peers and heroic colleagues and mentors, people like Bell Hooks and Kate Bornstein, who's been on this show, and Fly, who is a great artist, Christy Road, Inga Musio. Just I could go on and on. It's an amazing place, and for me, it's kind of just a different kind of level and validation to what I've been doing. So yeah, I've been working to get my part of it all together.
Yeah, we'll be looking forward to reading that. That's pretty exciting. And you, I really see you as this just amazing survivor and force that's come out of an incredible history and past. And maybe that would be a way to start, just talk a little bit about your own life and where things kind of started for you in terms of having a visionary outsider perspective on things.
Yes. Well, it's interesting because I think I realized from a really young age I had a very counterculture beginning in this world system that we're talking to each other in now, that I was birthed into. My parents were counterculture young people in the late 70s who just have their own interesting story of how they found each other. And my mother was a really heavy-duty trauma survivor. And it was actually said that it was unlikely that she could have kids because she was in a car accident that so badly damaged her left brain. And she had to learn kind of basic motor skills again. And my father, who was, according to my fundamentalist Christian parents, was the long-hair hippie freak who they didn't want around their 16-year-old daughter, but he fell in love with this 16-year-old, my mother, little Ruthie, from this giant family, and he would sit outside of her hospital room, and we basically just lived there, and then would do all the physical therapy with her, and was when they were considering kind of what to do next. My grandparents, the story I understand is they were going to put her in a nursing home for a while, and they couldn't figure out what to do with her because they had 7 other kids they were kind of dealing with too, and my father basically is like, well, then I want to marry her. And so my mother, which is interesting, though, her life kind of was always about dependency then, because she then became a legal custodian of my father because she was underage when they married. But then, about a year and a half later, I was born, and I was conceived in a cranberry bog shack that they were squatting in.
This was in the Pacific Northwest?
Right. This is in Washington State. And so, so my life, I would live in teepees with them. We would live in cars and shacks and cabins with no running water, electricity. And I think really the experience I had of living in the teepee put a whole new perspective on the ways you can live, the kind of just community and familial kind of experiences, because I was really then raised by this sort of radical counterculture tribe of indigenous people and kind of back to the land people and farmer communities. And, I was renamed Running Pony by a woman named Horsewoman. And I was known as Running Pony. My mother called me that until the day she died, until I was about 18 years old. But I was named Running Pony because this woman, Horsewoman, who lived in this shack with her whole deal was that she took horses that were going to be put down, and she lived in a stable with them, and she revitalized them. And so she gave me and my mom, we were living in this teepee, she gave me a part quarter horse, part Shetland pony, and I named it Co-Pony. And it literally was and it would wake me up in the morning, and I learned how to get on. The joke is that I could get on the back of this pony and ride through the trails down to where the breakfast nook was and stuff. I was about 2.5 years old at the time. So before I could run in a straight line, I could pull myself up onto Co-Pony, and Running Pony and Co-Pony would be going down the trails. We think it's such a different world. We treat our children so precious now, and in general, the mainstream really criminalizes youth, And so for me, having that radical root experience, it allowed me so much freedom and to look at the world from very different perspectives.
And it sounds like your mom was really kind of partly in this reality and partly in other realities too. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. And I think because she was a trauma survivor to such a physical and on so many different levels, and she was so different from a lot of people's expectation that she just, was an amazing force, and also a force, I didn't even know how to explain it. She was just so much in my life, and definitely the older I get, because she wouldn't conform. She was an intense anti-authoritarian, but because of that would deal with, being ostracized and being pathologized and being told that she was not smart. And I dealt with that a lot, that people like us, we weren't as smart as other people, and we moved around a lot. And I learned really early to make up a lot of different stories about who we were, because there was always a threat of our housing being taken away, or even me and my sister being taken away by things like Child Protective Services. And my first encounter with the mental health system was not voluntary, as is with a lot of people, and it was when I was a youth, and the public school system was concerned that I was being malnourished or that I had I remember I learned right away at like the age of 7 or 8, okay, I see what they want and the role they want me to play. And actually, this is kind of how I fell in love with being a performer. And I actually fell in love with the theater really young too. And what I found was it was such an early healing possibility for me because I could be a storyteller and move into so many different roles and shoes, and it would free me from some of the persecution or judgment that I would feel because my family's lifestyle and what was happening in my family was so kind of off the cuff, off the radar.
So your family really ran into a lot of confrontations and conflict with the system, with authorities and the police?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there would be times where it was pretty mellow, but that threat was always there because of oftentimes because of my mother's behaviors and the way she she wasn't going to conform, and she wouldn't, she would do a lot of really bizarre things that would confuse or maybe enrage people just because she wouldn't play into their social etiquette. So.
Do you think a lot of your own independence and nonconformism and power really comes from her in a lot of ways?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's so important for me, actually, to get in touch with that because oftentimes, especially the more kind of dependent she got on illegal substances, and she was always dealing with addiction issues. And I thread that back, though, to that first time with her in the hospital and how the system was always telling her that she always needed something else from outside to heal her within, whether it was drugs, vocational schools, or, she tried to work, but, I mean, she got fired from fast food restaurants because she, you know what I mean? Like, she got kicked out of vocational programs because she just wouldn't behave in the way that, And then they'd try to say, oh, she had the IQ of, 30-something and all. They would just... And that would just, of course, just break her spirit down. And but she was so childlike and so positive most of the time, and she was a real healer. And the work that she did that I think is so inspiring is she worked with kids with disabilities and also older people, and she was a private nurse for a few years, but it exposed me to all these people who were experiencing reality in different ways. I remember having friends with cerebral palsy who were children that she was taking care of, or this young boy with, I forget the name of I think something like Hunterson's disease or something. But I found myself really attracted to these kids and the way that they were experiencing the world, and found myself really wanting to be around them and feeling like we could learn things from each other. So I think, at the age of 9, I was kind of involved with disability rights.
And you had your own experiences with extreme states or different states of consciousness. So when did that really start for you as a kid?
I'm sure. Yes, absolutely. And I think it's also because I was exposed and living in so many different kinds of situations. As I got older, we sort of moved in closer to the suburbs of Seattle, and then we became, in different ways, kind of more the kind of lower class, working class stuff, lifestyle. So I was exposed to really spectrum. But my mom was the kind of person, she'd bring home hitchhikers or kind of freaks from the community, or, because they had this whole kind of extended, almost like beat hippie, back to the land, counterculture community. And oftentimes there'd be somebody else staying with us for different times. She was always taking people in. I remember waking up sometimes, there'd be somebody else sleeping on the couch. And when I was a kid, or sometimes it would be like, come on, because, you're a kid and you want your space and you're learning how to. But definitely now I realize I've taken that legacy on, and I find the power in it to shift out of this hierarchical culture really into a gift shared culture.
One of the things that I think is really true about your music and your work is this healing aspect to it. And it just really comes through very clearly. And you mentioned that your mom was a healer. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. I think that my mother just naturally carried around this, like I said, non-judgmental healing energy that just made you feel heard and listened to, and also a belief she really had a belief system in your own healing capacity, and we also knew we weren't going to rely. She knew that the healing wasn't coming from the institutions. I mean, she had mostly only experienced harm from the Western medical dependency model.
Your art is really the visionary experience. So tell us about that, and maybe when did that start becoming clear to you that that's part of who you were?
Well, I mean, there was a series of things starting when I was really young, and I always seemed to have a tool or what's the word I'm looking for, like a tangible kind of amulet or something that would pull me or that I would speak to in different realities. I was definitely the kind of kid who eating and sleeping were kind of afterthoughts. I was always kind of, my antennas and my skin was always open to this sort of what was happening all around. I was always excited to plug into it and make something of it, make a story or an event, or to be a part of making it almost a performance, wherever moment I was in, to feel like I can be a reality maker here. And that was like my mother made me a doll, a Raggedy Ann doll, before my sister was born, and it was like my best friend. I would talk with it. We'd swap clothes. It was my companion that I would tell my deepest secrets to. And then as I got a bit older and we were living closer into the suburbs of Seattle, I remember, I lived in a house too where my mom would go through so many different states that there was a lot of rage and a lot of pain, and oftentimes there'd be, dishes flying across the kitchen, things like, and I remember kind of feeling like, I don't know what love is unless it's things smashing around me. And one example of that is I had a little room where the doorknob from the door being slammed open and shut so much created a hole in the wall exactly the size of the doorknob. And at night when I'd be up making my little magical worlds at 4 a.m. before I could hear my dad at like 5 a.m. getting ready for work. He's a self-employed auto mechanic, and I'd get back in bed quickly so that he'd think I was sleeping all night before he came and woke me up. But sometimes what I'd do is I was convinced, and I still believe, that there was this kind of spirit entity in the wall behind, and that actually where the doorknob hit the wall. Actually, this was some of my first really writing, too, about my experience of, I was probably 14 when I started writing about this experience, and I named this entity spirit that was in the wall that could be a portal to many world systems. I called it Whisper. And it was this very androgynous, childlike, because I was a child, and I would talk. I'd put my little mouth up to that hole, and we would talk. And then later, a few years later, I would find the cello. And this would basically become my lifelong sort of amulet friend, like a dialogue that was connected to all sorts, beyond text, all kinds of communicating beyond sort of these dominant languages.
Did you yourself ever end up in therapy or in an institution or anything like that?
Well, I saw, my mom's greatest fear was being put, and she actually at times would say, I would rather die or be in jail or on the streets than in a psych ward. There was a lot of trauma for her around that, because the state hospital was in the Skagit Valley where she grew up, and she lived with the constant threat of that. And she had some uncles and stuff who had worked there, and they had thrown some of her brothers and sisters in there when they were on these kind of 60s acid trips they wouldn't come down from, and so the parents would throw them in the psych ward, her brothers and sisters. And then with her own experience with being in the hospital, because she was in a coma and stuff after this accident, she was physically to a profound, she had so much fear and paranoia and rage about that. So I always, at such a young age, to hear that she would rather die, What did happen is what I was explaining. Well, the first time was when the public schools sent this child psychiatrist to our house, and I was so upset with them because, it was completely the stereotype too. This guy with the white guy with the beard, get a little turtleneck sweater, and the whole stereotype, and me too, feeling like just all this shame, like. He came to the house to see if I was being malnourished, and I remember looking at my dad and being like, I'm so sorry, but it was nothing, there was nothing wrong, but me knowing, okay, I just have to play this game to make him know everything's okay and tell him to go away, or that, everything's fine. And And then what would happen later is I would often get persecuted by default because of other, because my mother then would find heroin as sort of a self-soothing, and then there would be a lot of then altercations with police and the whole gamut, and this would then affect my high school years, and having teachers or whatever pull me aside because they see my mother obviously so strung out, and then they're under this guise of concern. But I mean, I literally had the principal at this one school when I was in high school actually pulled me into her office, and she had called my dad in. And again, for me, my dad worked so hard, and I always felt kind of protective of him, to have him be taken from work. And basically, she wanted to know if I was a drug dealer or doing drugs. And by this time, I was getting into Riot Grrl, feminism, music. I was a vegan. I was going to Earth First meetings and Queer Nation. I was getting totally radicalized in this is in Capitol Hill in Seattle, which kind of was the area where you could be kind of a freak and stuff. And this was allegedly this progressive alternative school. And then I felt so much shame. And my dad was the one who had to look at the principal and say, this isn't Madigan at all. Her mother is a heroin addict. And it was the first time actually that I heard my dad say to somebody else outside of our family. And I had so much shame. I just started, tears. I couldn't look her in the face. And I wanted to throttle her, to be honest. And then she it was so insensitive, And I remember she looked at me and kind of put her hand on my shoulder and said, "I know what you're going through. My husband is a chain smoker." And I remember my dad and I looked at each other. We kind of had a little chuckle, and part of me is going, "Okay, you upper middle class liberal." I was 18 at the time, so radicalized. But me and my dad actually had this bonding thing where we're like, "We know she means well, and thanks." And basically, can we go now?
So you really managed to steer clear of the whole institutional thing, just completely suspicious of it from the very beginning.
Totally. And I mean, coming off psychiatry, it just was instilled in me so early. But then also, there's other family members who really needed help and stuff that couldn't be there any other way besides getting some disability and these kind of things. So then later, I would really become an advocate of services and treatment on demand and harm reduction. And I started to learn a whole new language that wasn't just about judgment and shame, but was about systemic systems change. And I applied my experiences and passion and activism. And I started to then, because, in the world of independent rock and all these things, there can be a bit of a separation between these political institutions and then the way we form relationships that are healing.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested and want to talk to you about the mental health advocacy and activism that you do and your vision of what that's all about. But you mentioned the cello earlier. Yeah. When did the cello come in? And how did you develop this amazing, magical relationship? And tell us about that relationship.
Yeah. Well, the story in a nutshell is that I was in the 4th grade at another school, because I was always the new girl. And there was this, thankfully, there was this Meet the Instruments Day.
How old were you?
9, yeah. And they paraded all of the 4th graders into this cafeteria, and they had all these instruments set up, and there was some teachers and stuff. And they were kind of herding kids in different directions and also letting them self-elect a bit. And I remember at first I went right for the trumpet. And I put my mouth on the tune. I remember they had the little mouthwash thing they would dip. It was just so silly when I think about it now. But the woman though said to me, "Oh no, I think your mouth's all wrong for the trumpet." I was there, okay. So I remember going to another line, and there was a violin, but the girl in front of me, it was so squeaky, and then I remember out of the corner of my eye seeing behind this piano a big violin, and something clicked in me, and I started saying, "No, okay." And I think because I felt shut down by that woman, I was like, "That's what I want. What's that big violin? Can I play that? Can I try that?" And the woman was, "Oh, no, we decided we're not getting it out. We're not getting out." And she started to say, "Oh, but there's these flutes over here." And me even feeling again, because I was usually the kind of smallest girl in the room, in the class. I was very small for my size. I was feeling really like she kept trying to send me, to these little petite things. And I sort of lost it. I threw a tantrum. I started screaming, I want the big violin. That's what I want, the big violin. And finally, they pulled it out. And she said, okay, hands it to me. And I remember putting my arms around it, and it was just like the doll that my mom made me. It was like hearing whisper in the door. I just running my hands on it and its body, and it felt like a woman's body or my body, or so human yet wooden. And it took me back to, living in the teepees and the trees and the forest. And then when I held that bow with the horsehair. It's horsehair in the bow. It's almost like it connected everything up to that point together. And I said, what is it? What is this? She said, it's a cello. That was the first time I heard anybody say that word out loud. And I remember running home from school that day. And, my mom's at home, and she was, doing bong hits or something, really loaded. And I remember, Mom, I know what I'm going to do. I know what I want. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to play the cello. And I remember she looked over at me. She kind of smiled, and she saw I was so happy. But then she just said, what the heck is that? And even in that moment, I thought, yes, I'm going to make this amazing wooden thing I just had my arm around. I'm going to make it about us. I'm going to make it about my mom. I'm going to sort of make it who we are. And of course, that's exactly what I set out to do.
And then how did you go from the kind of like elementary school music classes into punk rock and Riot Grrl with the cello? Because no one had really done that before.
That's right. What ended up happening is it then became my lifelong companion, like it continues to be. And I would, there was plenty of schools I went to that didn't have orchestra programs or anything. So I'd ask them, and gratefully they would bus me to schools that did. So I can read, thanks to the public schools. And I really am an advocate of obviously arts and music programs and just arts programs being available. Because as we know, since even that time, they've been drastically reduced, which is terrifying. But I just started taking it on this alternate journey. I would do the orchestra thing, but it's so hierarchical. It's about chairs. It's kind of about shame. And usually the kids with the most money and the most would be up front, and they'd have the private lessons. And I never had private lessons or anything like that. I mean, my dad tried really hard, and he did at times try to say, well, you want to... But what ended up happening is actually I would stay after sometimes just making noises that weren't in the little Mozart suite we were working on. And I remember, luckily, in like the 7th or 8th grade, I had this teacher, Adrienne Sabo, and I want to publicly thank Adrienne Sabo because she was kind of a younger music teacher, and she was a cellist and a trombonist. And a lot of times the music teachers were usually violin players or something, so they would focus on that part of the orchestra. But she happened to be a cellist, and she heard what I was doing, and she said, wow, do you want to continue to explore this? And I was like, yeah. And so I would stay after and kind of help her sweep up, and she started to introduce me to other things outside of classical music. There was this thing called strolling strings she showed me, which was kind of like dinner music, turn of the century, like small chamber works that were a little more 20th century. So that whetted my appetite. And then later, I would end up in the school that I graduated from, which was like a performing arts school of the arts and humanities, college preparatory school. And it was I knew it was kind of the end of my run of academia. With all this unschooling stuff I had and being carted around, I kind of, by 15, 16, I was like, yeah, I'm over this game. I got too many interests. But I got into this school on a music and theater scholarship. And there weren't very many scholarship kids. But I told the orchestra director that I didn't want to be there anymore, and I wanted to join the jazz band. And the jazz band was led by this guy, Floyd Staniford, who was actually a protege of Coltrane. And there was no other women in the jazz band. So I joined the jazz band with my cello, and Floyd introduced me to Coltrane's Naima, and that I taught myself that bass part on the cello, which is just like this liturgical heartbeat of one of the most beautiful, I think, pieces of jazz music as far as just soothing, healing music. And And then I was in, Seattle in the early 90s, and I was the singer. I, started to become with all the jazz band guys and blah, blah, blah. And we started these punk bands, and there was, of course, the whole Olympia scene. And, so we started to drive down to Olympia because that's where there was more all ages shows. And I just got exposed to this community of punk that was really an ideology of find your creative voice and share it with us. And I was seeing performance and music and words that, I'd never heard on the radio or seen on TV or just my kind of exposure. And I just, I started, I had always started writing, turning my poems and those sounds I was making with the cello into songs. And I also had taught myself guitar with some of my dad's help because there was, the poor man's piano. There's usually an acoustic guitar. We couldn't take a piano around everywhere we moved, but we could take an acoustic guitar. And so with those skills, I started to write songs and just learning other songs through books or traditional songs or House of the Rising Sun was one of the first songs I taught myself, actually. And then I just knew that I could bring the cello on the journey with me because, hey, that was even more punk than, to me, it was almost like I was hearing a lot of the calling out, people doing the louder, explosive, the music that was really energetic and discordant. And I started to realize, wow, I could do this with what I had access to, these acoustic instruments. And instead of having it be an outward explosion of energy and rage and voicing, voice of people who are marginalized and silenced, that I could do it by kind of going in and drawing people closer and having them lean in. And when I started Tattletale with this woman, Jen Wood, who was at that high school with me, I saw her playing the acoustic guitar in the hallway, and I just said, "Are you writing songs?" She's very shyly like, "Oh, well, I don't know, not really, not." And I was like, "Kind of sounds like you got some songs there or something." And finally, she took me back to her house and played me, and I just said, "Well, look, I've been working on this stuff, and like, we got to do a band. You want to write songs with me?" And it just became this organic thing. And next thing you know, we're playing at these hardcore boys shows where, they got their shirts off and it's hardcore straight edge music and all this stuff. And then then when it was our turn to play, we would play right in the middle of the mosh pit where all that energy just was without any mics or anything. And we would just get in the middle of that space and we would play these songs, and these like teenage shirtless sweaty boys would just sit down and lean in and kind of touch each other, and they're listening to us. She was 15 at the time. I had maybe just turned 17. And, I was people were crying. It was like this, we didn't have access to that. And in this community, especially a youth community that's so oftentimes about high energy, but to have the energy be about looking in and listening, and then to actually emotionally respond and make ourselves emotionally vulnerable to each other, to me, that became what was missing from our community. And and it spoke so profoundly to me. And I've really dedicated my craft to that, where the micro and the macro have this symbiotic link.
Yeah, tell us about how you go about creating songs, because there's some kind of magical channeling, visioning that's going on there. So how is it that you're able to tap into that energy?
Oh, wow. It's been such, it's very fluid and kind of cyclical, and it expands and changes a lot. A lot of times I'll have either a feeling, some words, an idea, or I'll have a bit of a melody or tones, and then I'll just throw them out kind of into the ether, and they'll start to cycle back to me. I feel like I'm actually constantly writing, because I'm a note taker and observer and a sort of live wire for this moment. And every moment to me is kind of an alive, electric, organic data that I'm conversing with. And this is really what keeps me excited about being in this reality right now, keeps me away from what I call my deep pressing end, or my relationship to suicide as a choice. And as, and the cello, I can't tell you, it's so interesting. Just whenever I it's almost like there's always something waiting there to reveal itself to me. And am I in a position to hear it and absorb it? And then what can I kind of sculpt with it? And it's very emotional, and sometimes it's very small. And then things will develop out of it. And it's been everywhere from where I've written a few words and had these melodies or just tones, and then I let go of them literally for years. And then they come back and reveal what they need to be now, and I let them go. Sometimes finishing, because I'm almost like a jazz or blues person that way, where it's a vamp or an idea, and it's there to be it's there for the moment to inform what it needs to say or be, And sometimes, though, I've definitely had the experience where I sit down and there's just a story or, something I need to say, and it just presents itself. Like my song Scraps, for example. It was one of the first times that I just put the cello up on my lap like a big ukulele or a big guitar or something, and I just started plucking out this melody, and these words started coming to me. And I was just singing this song, Scraps, this very much about longing and letting go and the process of love and being loved and wanting but can't saying you want, and do they want me? And it was, because I was always very self-conscious about writing quote-unquote love songs or being singer, because I also came from these punk communities, and sometimes I'd say, oh, those hum and strum people with their, I was very aware of that. But so this song is so interesting to me, because it was almost like 2 hours or less of me just going through, and the song was there. And and then later that song would be used as the end title credits in movies, but it just wanted to be out in the world.
Said you had no place to go. Were standing in the doorway of our home, and how can I run to you when you run away? How can I run to you? Couldn't see the backlight all night. Think you've gone, I guess you've gone. Build your house from scraps, make a home out of laughs. Build your house from scraps, make a home out of love. And love, and love, and love, and love, and love, and love. And I'm here waiting to see if you've come and found the key. When time pulled you where you used to be, but I'm not waiting on eventually. No, I'm not waiting. I'll wait. These cracks of everything we hope that we your house from scraps. Make a home out of laughs and love and love and love and love and love and love.
So you mentioned that you feel like you're like a live wire for the present moment, which is an amazing idea of being receptive to the universe. Is there a way in which that kind of vulnerability can be difficult? Is it challenging? Does it kind of affect your wellness and sustainability? And how do you kind of keep yourself kind of on an even keel with all these energies and forces that you're working with?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think I first started to really notice my sensitivities about how I was being conscious of how I could then communicate what was happening to me or how much I was feeling to the people around me. And it was very hard for me, even usually it was just a few people I really loved or could love who I could admit vulnerabilities to, or that I couldn't handle everything that was happening. So oftentimes it would be me being so alive and aware and seeing all the subtext, feeling the nuance, having the white elephant like want to scoop me up. And I felt like I oftentimes too was the one who had to say what nobody wanted to say. And then people would get scared of me though, but I didn't know how to, that truth, the sort of hard truth, people would start to expect it from me, and then they'd become freaked out, challenged because it was almost like I couldn't not express it, or I didn't know how to express it in a way that was compassionate, or maybe in a way that, I don't always have to be the one who says it, that had taken me a long time. But what it did, it alienated me from a lot of people. So I related to the isolation. And I had so much of my own trauma, like after my mom died and people really close to me kind of couldn't handle it. People who were close to me and didn't know that she was using heroin. And then it started kind of a process of abandonment. And a lot of people would die in my life and my family. So then I was so aware of mortality and our relationship to it that was really the hard thing, was the isolation stuff. And then just the few people that I could feel really close to, kind of bombarding them with the stuff that I didn't want the rest of the world, or kind of a public world, to know was happening with me. And it was after this process of feeling like I was burning out my lovers and friends, or else, and being more aware too that, okay, I need to put more of my healing in my own hands, as far as how I eat and when I eat. That has always been a big one for me. How I create time and a schedule that is healing and I don't feel judged by it. If I need to be in the world sleeping from 6 a.m. to noon, not to feel like I'm bad and being judged, because this is where I'm at, and have people support that. And then most significantly, of course, when I really started to look at my relationship to wanting to die and when that was happening, or because there was friends, peer artists of mine who were in this series of time taking their own life too, and that kept coming back. Like, why are these amazing artists who are my mentors and stuff burning out so quickly?
Like Kurt Cobain and other people.
Yeah, and then Jeff Buckley, and then, of course, Elliott Smith, who I had performed and worked with. We were both working with the Kill Rock Stars label. I found, it was actually September 10th, 2001, that I went to a Mental Health Association conference for people with compulsive hoarding and cluttering kind of issues in their lives. And I felt, because this live wire sentimentalized a lot of stuff, and it was actually this eviction, and my partner said, your stuff everywhere, the way everything became, the socks that I'd wore the day before had some poetic message. I had to keep them right there. No, don't move them yet. It was, and she just said, I think maybe you should check this out or something. And I ended up going to this conference, and I started going to the support meetings Then the kind of position of facilitator, moderator was sort of offered to me, and I put in a bid for the position, and it ended up that it was funded by a class action lawsuit, people who had been mistreated by the mental health system. And I was then hired on a third time to be a third-time mental health advocate and doing systems change and also looking at housing and homelessness and access and reasonable accommodation for people with mental health, quote-unquote, disabilities. And so this whole community was opened up to me, and I would go on this really cool journey that would eventually lead me to the Icarus Project and becoming then a part of the collective that we're doing now. But that time was very important, that bridge. And it definitely made me committed to the political work of how when we make this like treatment on demand and harm reduction as really important examples, the kinds of access people have, we really are, we're saving lives together by changing the lack of choice and the lack of information and creating options for making this world livable,
And what about for you now? What is it that's inspiring for you? What kind of vision are you really working from these days?
Well, I think now that I've found and am a part of cultivating this community that is talking about the experiences that get pathologized, the experiences that get called mental illness, I have access to so many people now who are talking about states of conscious and mood extremes. And this is the kind of journey that I feel safe talking about my own experience with all those things. And so the kind of writing, the community, the support, of course, now being one of the founding collective members of Icarus and really looking at power sharing, horizontalism, how we are in mutual aid with each other to share the resources and be the kind of community that we're, I like to say we are the web that we weave together to save our own lives and to create a world worth not only living in, but thriving in, a world worth being excited to contribute to. Because that's something that I think my mother didn't quite get in her lifetime. And that's definitely fuels my plight. And it's making beautiful collaborative projects and albums and touring and speaking and learning from communities of creativity and resistance. And I'm getting to go to Chiapas for the first time, and being a child who has always been involved in finding my own indigenous core and being around indigenous peoples. And this feels like a very exciting time in a kind of global awakening way for the humble, simple people, as the Zapatistas like to say, but for all of us to heal.
Thanks a lot for joining us on Madness Radio, Bonfire Madigan Shive.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to an interview with Bonfire Madigan Shive, and the music clip that we listened to was called Scraps. It's originally from Saddle the Bridge, which is no longer in print, but you can get I Bleed, A Decade of Song, which is an anthology of Madigan's music, by going to her great website, bonfiremadigan.com. There's a lot of really interesting stuff up there, photos and information about Madigan's life and work. And also be on the lookout for the Seven Stories Press anthology that's going to be including a chapter that Madigan wrote. Madigan's also working with Madness Radio to do some co-hosting of upcoming shows, so stay tuned for that. And also, she's been working really hard for the last couple of years on a new album. Very exciting. I've had the fortune of hearing some of the new songs from this album, and I think there's a couple of things on her website that you can listen to, and it's absolutely amazing, mind-blowing, inspiring, visionary music that defies all categorization. Definitely comes out of the punk rock spirit, but brings a lot of classical and folk and hip-hop influences. So we'll be looking forward to Madigan's new album to be released soon. That's about all the time we have this week for Madness Radio. Thanks a lot for tuning in. You've been listening to Madness Radio, Voices and Visions from Outside Mental Health. Madness Radio is broadcast every Wednesday, 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Pacifica affiliate WXOJ-LP-FM 103.3 Valley Free Radio in Northampton, Massachusetts. For our live internet stream, podcasting, show archives, and more, visit madnessradio.net. Madness Radio is co-produced by Freedom Center and the Icarus Project. For more information, check out freedom-center.org and theicarusproject.net. For more mental health radio, listen to the News Hour from mindfreedom.org, Wednesdays, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you have an idea for a story or guest on Madness Radio, or you just want to share what's in your head, contact us at radio@madnessradio.net.